Someone you loved is dead, maybe last week, maybe 20 years ago. The grave is real. The funeral was real. The body that held them is no longer there. And yet, you have felt them in the room. You have heard their voice. You have caught their scent in a place they never visited. You have woken in the dark, certain that they were sitting at the foot of your bed. You have not told anyone, because you know how it sounds. You think you are losing your mind. You are not losing your mind. Half of the people who have lost someone they love report experiencing exactly what you have experienced. Not in dreams, not in memory, in waking life. The phenomenon has a name. In the medical literature, the phenomenon has been documented across more than 50 years of peer-reviewed research. The question that the research raises is not whether the phenomenon is real. The phenomenon is real. The question is what it actually means. The question is whether the bereaved are perceiving something that exists in some form outside their own minds, or whether they are generating the experience entirely from within their own grieving neural systems, or whether the distinction between these two possibilities is itself less clear than ordinary thinking would suggest. None of these possibilities can be definitively ruled out by the current state of research. What follows is an examination of what the research actually shows, what the most thoughtful interpretations of the research suggest, and what the great contemplative traditions of the world have articulated across thousands of years about whether the dead can still hear the living who remain behind. Whether you find any of this persuasive is a question that you will need to answer for yourself. The foundational study on the sense presence of the dead was published in 1971 by the British physician Dewi Rees in the British Medical Journal. Rees, working at a clinic in mid-Wales, conducted systematic interviews with 293 widows and widowers in his community, asking about their experiences in the months and years following the death of their spouses. The findings were striking enough to have shaped subsequent research across half a century. 47% of the bereaved reported experiences of the deceased's continued presence. 14% reported hearing the deceased's voice. 12% reported having held conversations with the deceased. 3% reported being touched by the deceased. The phenomena were more common in the widowed, who had reported having had longer and happier marriages. The phenomena were not associated with mental illness or with any particular religious belief. The bereaved who reported these experiences were, by every measure that Rees was able to apply, ordinary people having ordinary responses to ordinary grief. The Rees study had several methodological features that have made it influential beyond its initial findings. The study was conducted in a single defined community, allowing Rees to interview a substantial percentage of the actually bereaved within that community, rather than relying on a self-selected sample of those who chose to report their experiences. The study used systematic interview protocols that allowed for direct comparison of responses across subjects. The study controlled for variables including the duration of the marriage, the religiosity of the bereaved, and the manner of the spouse's death. The methodological care that Rees applied to the study has allowed subsequent researchers to take the findings seriously as documented data about an actual phenomenon, rather than as anecdotal reports that could be dismissed as the products of grief-induced imagination. The findings have survived the kind of scrutiny that would have eliminated less robust observations from continuing scientific consideration. The Rees findings have been replicated and extended across the subsequent decades by various researchers in different cultural contexts. The work of Agneta Grimby in Sweden, the work of Edie Stephan in the United Kingdom, the work of Erlendur Haraldsson in Iceland, and various other studies have documented similar percentages across populations as different as can be imagined. The phenomenon is not a function of any specific religious tradition. The phenomenon is not a function of any specific cultural expectation. The phenomenon appears across human populations with substantial consistency. suggesting that the phenomenon has something to do with the basic structure of human grief, rather than with the specific cultural frameworks within which the grief is processed. What this consistency means is one of the questions that the broader inquiry has to address. The Swiss neuroscientist Olaf Blanke and his collaborators at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne have provided some of the most striking findings on the neurological basis of sensed presence experiences in general. Their research, published across many papers in journals, including Nature and Neuron, has documented that direct electrical stimulation of a specific region of the brain, called the temporoparietal junction, can produce sensed presence experiences in patients who would not otherwise have such experiences. The patients describe the sensation of another being present in the room, often standing directly behind them or beside them, with the sensation being indistinguishable from the experience of an actual person being present. The stimulation produces the experience reliably and reproducibly, with the patients being able to describe in detail the apparent location and characteristics of the sensed being. The methodological precision of the Blanke research deserves particular attention. The patients in whom the sensed presence experiences were produced were not bereaved persons. They were not in any specific emotional state. They were undergoing standard neurological evaluation for various medical conditions, with the stimulation being applied as part of clinical protocols rather than for purposes related to the sensed presence research itself. The reliability with which the stimulation produced the experiences across multiple patients in clinical contexts that had nothing to do with grief established that the neural mechanism for sensed presence experiences exists in the brain, independently of grief. The mechanism is something that the brain can do under specific conditions, regardless of whether those conditions involve loss or simply involve specific patterns of electrical activity in the temporoparietal region. The findings from Blanke's research raise the question of how the documented experiences of sensed presence in the bereaved relate to the neurological mechanisms that the laboratory research has identified. The materialist interpretation of the findings holds that the sensed presence experiences in the bereaved involve activation of the same temporoparietal junction mechanisms that Blanke's research has documented, with the activation being triggered by the specific cognitive and emotional conditions of grief, rather than by direct electrical stimulation. The interpretation has substantial empirical support and has become the dominant framework within mainstream neuroscience for understanding sensed presence experiences. The interpretation does not necessarily settle the broader question of what such experiences mean. The interpretation establishes that the experiences have a neural basis, which would be true regardless of whether the experiences corresponded to anything outside the brain. The neural basis of seeing a chair does not establish that there is no chair outside the brain. The work of Mary Frances O'Connor at the University of Arizona has provided one of the most sophisticated contemporary treatments of how grief operates within the brain. O'Connor, whose book The Grieving Brain has summarized the field for general readers, has documented through extensive neuroimaging research that the loss of a beloved person produces neural and physiological changes that involve specific regions of the brain associated with attachment, reward, and the prediction of the presence of others. The research has established that grief is not merely a psychological response to loss, but is a complex biological process involving the same neural systems that operated to maintain the attachment during the life of the beloved person. The brain that has lost a beloved person has not simply lost an external object. The brain has lost a part of its own internal model of reality, with the loss requiring extensive remodeling of the neural circuits that had been built to accommodate the presence of the beloved. The specific neural mechanisms that O'Connor's research has documented deserve attention because of their implications for understanding sensed presence experiences. The research has identified specific patterns of activity in the nucleus accumbens, a region of the brain associated with reward and attachment in bereaved individuals encountering reminders of the deceased. The activity patterns are similar to the patterns that operate during the active maintenance of attachment to living persons, suggesting that the brain continues to operate as if the attachment relationship were continuing, rather than treating the death as a definitive ending of the relationship. The research has also identified specific patterns in regions associated with reward prediction error, with these patterns being consistent with the brain continuing to predict that the beloved should be present and being repeatedly surprised by the absence. The neural substrate for the ongoing relationship is, on the framework that emerges from this research, substantially preserved across the period following the death. The implications of O'Connor's research for understanding sensed presence experiences are substantial. The neural circuits that had been built to predict the presence of the beloved person do not simply disappear when the person dies. The circuits continue to operate, producing predictions that the person should be present, with the predictions being violated when the person is not actually there. The sensed presence experiences may, on one interpretation, be manifestations of these continued predictions, with the brain producing the experience of the person being present, because its predictive systems are still operating as if the person were alive. The interpretation provides a sophisticated framework for understanding the phenomenon without requiring any commitment to the existence of the person outside the bereaved's own brain. But the interpretation does not by itself rule out alternative possibilities. The work of Karl Friston at University College London on predictive processing provides a broader theoretical framework within which the O'Connor findings can be understood. Friston's framework, developed across many papers and influential within contemporary neuroscience, treats the brain as fundamentally engaged in predicting its sensory inputs based on internal models of the world. The brain does not passively receive information about reality. The brain actively generates predictions about what should be present based on its accumulated models, with the predictions being compared against actual sensory input and the discrepancies being used to refine the models. The framework has implications for understanding sensed presence experiences. If the brain has built an extensive model of the beloved person across years or decades of shared life, the model continues to operate after the death, generating predictions that the person should be present. When the predictions encounter sensory ambiguity, the brain may resolve the ambiguity in favor of the predicted presence rather than in favor of the actual absence, producing the experience of sensed presence. The Friston framework has a deeper implication that bears on the broader inquiry. The framework treats all perception as fundamentally constructive rather than as merely passive reception of external information. The chair that you see across the room from you is, on this framework, not simply a chair that your eyes detect. The chair is a construction that your brain produces based on its predictions about what should be there and the sensory information that confirms or modifies those predictions. The implications for understanding sensed presence experiences follow from the broader framework. If all perception is constructive, then the experience of a deceased person being present is constructive in the same fundamental way as the experience of any other person being present. The question of whether the construction corresponds to an external reality is, on this framework, a question that arises for all perception rather than only for sensed presence experiences. The materialist interpretation that treats sensed presence experiences as mere illusions while treating ordinary perception as accurate access to external reality may be applying a standard that ordinary perception itself does not meet. The Friston framework, taken together with the O'Connor findings, provides a substantially complete account of sense-presence experiences in the bereaved within the merely materialist framework. The account does not require the existence of the deceased person outside the bereaved's brain. The account explains the consistency of the phenomenon across cultures and across centuries. The account explains why the phenomenon is more common in those who had longer and happier marriages. The account explains why the phenomenon does not depend on specific religious belief. The materialist framework has the resources to explain the phenomenon entirely within its own commitments. Whether this explanation exhausts what the phenomenon actually involves is a different question. The work of Peter Fenwick, the British neuropsychiatrist whose research on end-of-life experiences spans decades, provides a different but related body of evidence that bears on the broader question. Fenwick, who worked at the Institute of Psychiatry at King's College London for much of his career, conducted extensive systematic research on what the dying actually experience in their final hours and days. The findings, published in various peer-reviewed papers and summarized for general readers in his book The Art of Dying, have documented that a substantial percentage of dying patients report specific kinds of experiences in the period preceding death. These include experiences of being visited by deceased loved ones, experiences of being able to see and communicate with persons who are not visible to the medical staff or family present, and experiences of preparing for an impending transition that the dying person describes in specific terms. The specific phenomenology of the deathbed visions that Fenwick documented deserves attention because of its consistency. The visitors that dying patients reported seeing were predominantly deceased family members, most commonly parents or spouses who had died years or decades earlier. The visitors were described as present in the room, communicating with the dying patient through what the patient experienced as direct interaction rather than mere imagination. The dying patients often reported that the visitors were waiting to accompany them through the impending transition, with the visitors being experienced as having come specifically for this purpose. The experiences were not associated with the medication that the dying patients were receiving, with similar experiences being reported across patients who were receiving substantially different medication protocols. The experiences were associated with the proximity of death, rather than with the specific medical interventions being applied. The Fenwick findings have been controversial within mainstream medicine, with various critics arguing that the findings reflect the cognitive effects of dying brains rather than any genuine perceptual experiences of the dying. The materialist interpretation of the findings holds that the brain in the final hours of life undergoes specific changes that produce the kinds of experiences that Fenwick has documented, with the experiences being consequences of the dying process rather than perceptions of any external reality. The interpretation has substantial support in what is known about the neurology of dying brains. The interpretation does not by itself settle the question of what the experiences mean. The interpretation establishes that the experiences have a neural basis, which would be expected regardless of whether the experiences corresponded to anything outside the brain. The Fenwick findings raise an additional consideration that bears on the broader inquiry. The experiences that Fenwick has documented are remarkably consistent across cultures and across religious traditions. Dying patients in Western secular contexts report similar experiences to dying patients in Eastern religious contexts, with the specific cultural framing differing, but the underlying phenomena being substantially similar. The consistency suggests that whatever is happening in dying brains is a feature of the dying process itself, rather than a function of specific cultural expectations. The consistency does not establish that the experiences correspond to any external reality, but the consistency does suggest that the phenomenon is robust enough to warrant continued investigation rather than dismissal. The work of Dennis Klass, Phyllis Silverman, and Stephen Nickman in their 1996 book Continuing Bonds represented one of the most significant paradigm shifts in the broader field of grief research. The earlier framework that had dominated grief research, articulated most fully through the influential work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and various other earlier researchers, had treated grief as a process of letting go of the deceased and moving on to a life that did not include them. The Klass framework challenged this earlier view by documenting that healthy adaptation to loss often involves the maintenance of an ongoing relationship with the deceased, rather than the severing of all connection. The bereaved who maintained what Klass and his colleagues called continuing bonds with the deceased often had better outcomes than those who attempted to sever all connection. With the continuing bonds taking various forms, including ongoing internal conversations with the deceased, the maintenance of physical objects associated with the deceased, and the preservation of rituals and practices that had been shared with the deceased during their life. The specific findings of the Klass research deserve attention because of their implications for understanding sensed presence experiences. The bereaved who reported feeling the continued presence of the deceased, who reported holding internal conversations with the deceased, and who reported experiencing the deceased as still part of their lives, generally showed better psychological adjustment than those who attempted to suppress all such experiences. The findings suggested that the relationship with the deceased was not simply a function of the deceased being externally present, but was a function of the bereaved, cultivating their own ongoing engagement with the relationship. The findings have substantial implications for how grief should be approached therapeutically, but the findings also have implications for understanding what the relationship with the deceased actually consists of after the biological event of death. The Klass framework has substantial implications for understanding sensed presence experiences. The framework treats such experiences not as pathological symptoms that the bereaved should work to eliminate, but as manifestations of the ongoing relationship that healthy grief often involves. The framework does not commit itself to any specific position on whether the deceased actually exists in some form outside the bereaved's own consciousness. The framework simply documents that the relationship continues in some form, with the form being psychologically real for the bereaved and being associated with better rather than worse adaptation to loss. The implications for clinical practice have been substantial, with grief counselling having shifted substantially over the past several decades, from frameworks that encourage severing connection to frameworks that encourage cultivation of continuing bonds in healthy forms. 3 substantially different interpretations of the documented evidence are possible, and the careful position requires acknowledging all 3 rather than dismissing any in favour of one preferred view. The first interpretation, the materialist interpretation, holds that all the documented phenomena are products of brain processes that operate entirely within the bereaved or dying individual, with no external reality corresponding to the experiences of sensed presence or continuing communication. The interpretation has substantial empirical support in the Blanke, O'Connor, and Friston research. The interpretation has the advantage of operating entirely within the framework of mainstream neuroscience without requiring any theoretical extensions. The interpretation has the difficulty of having to explain why the experiences should have the specific phenomenology they have, including the felt reality of the encountered persons and the consistency of the experiences across cultures and contexts. The second interpretation, what might be called the psychological persistence interpretation, holds that the deceased continue to exist in a meaningful sense within the consciousness of the bereaved, but does not commit to any position on whether they exist outside that consciousness. The interpretation has substantial empirical support in the Klass framework of continuing bonds. The interpretation has the advantage of being able to accommodate the felt reality of the experiences without requiring any commitment to metaphysical claims that exceed what current research can establish. The interpretation treats the question of external existence as one that current research cannot settle and that perhaps cannot be settled in principle. The third interpretation, the speculative interpretation, holds that the documented phenomena may be evidence for some form of continued existence of the deceased that exceeds what the merely materialist framework can capture. The interpretation has support in the various philosophical frameworks that we will examine in subsequent stages of the inquiry, including the block universe interpretation of relativity, the Penrose-Hameroff orchestrated objective reduction theory of consciousness, and the David-Bohm framework of the implicate order. The interpretation has the difficulty of involving theoretical extensions that have not been definitively established. The interpretation has the advantage of taking the phenomenology of the experiences at face value, rather than reducing it to merely neural mechanisms. All three interpretations are consistent with the documented evidence. The current state of research does not adjudicate definitively between them. The interpretation that you find most compelling will depend on what theoretical commitments you bring to the evidence and on what considerations you take to be most important in evaluating competing explanations. The careful position recognizes that all three interpretations have serious defenders within the broader field, and that the question of which interpretation is correct is more open than the popular treatments of the phenomenon often suggest. There is a significant additional consideration that bears on how the three interpretations should be weighed against each other. The materialist interpretation requires the fewest theoretical commitments and operates within the well-established frameworks of contemporary neuroscience. The speculative interpretation requires more theoretical commitments, but takes the phenomenology of the experiences seriously rather than reducing it to neural mechanisms that the experiences themselves do not feel like. The psychological persistence interpretation sits between these two positions, accommodating the felt reality of the experiences without committing to metaphysical claims that exceed what current research can establish. Each interpretation has its own strengths and weaknesses, and none can be eliminated on the basis of current evidence alone. The careful inquirer has to weigh the considerations and arrive at their own position rather than expecting the inquiry to settle the question definitively. The implications of these three interpretations for how a bereaved person should engage with the experience of sensed presence are interestingly different. The materialist interpretation suggests that the experience is a neural artifact that does not correspond to anything outside the brain, with the implication being that the experience should be understood as a feature of grief rather than as a perception of an external reality. The psychological persistence interpretation suggests that the experience reflects the genuine continuation of the relationship within the consciousness of the bereaved, with the implication being that the experience can be cultivated as part of healthy grief without commitment to any metaphysical claims. The speculative interpretation suggests that the experience may be evidence of something more, with the implication being that the experience can be engaged with the kind of openness to deeper realities that the contemplative traditions have cultivated across thousands of years. The question of which interpretation is correct cannot be settled by the current state of research. The question of how a bereaved person should engage with the experience is a question that each person has to answer for themselves, based on what they find most compelling among the available interpretations, and on what considerations they take to be most important in their own engagement with loss. The inquiry that follows will examine what the deeper physics may suggest about the possibility that consciousness has features that exceed what the merely materialist framework allows, and what the great contemplative traditions of the world have articulated across thousands of years about whether the dead can still hear the living. Whether any of these subsequent considerations should affect your own engagement with the question is itself a question that you will need to answer for yourself. There is a particular pattern in the contemplative traditions that bears mentioning at this preliminary stage because it sets up the broader inquiry. The great religious traditions of the world, despite their substantial theological differences and despite developing across widely separated cultures, have all arrived at structurally similar positions on the question of whether the dead continue to exist in some form and whether they remain accessible to the living. The Christian tradition has developed the doctrine of the communion of saints, which holds that all who have died in Christ remain part of the living church and remain accessible to the living through specific practices. The Buddhist tradition has developed the framework of the Bardo, articulated most fully in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which holds that consciousness passes through specific intermediate states after biological death before either reaching liberation or being reborn. The Hindu tradition has developed extensive frameworks for understanding what happens to consciousness after biological death, with the various paths described in texts, including the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads. The convergence between these traditions on the recognition that biological death is not the complete cessation that the merely materialist framework would suggest is one of the more striking patterns in the broader history of human thought. The Christian doctrine of the communion of saints has been developed across 2,000 years of theological reflection, with the framework holding that the Church includes not only the living, but also those who have died, and that the various members of this expanded Church remain in genuine relationship with each other. The framework, articulated through the work of Augustine in his treatise De Cura Pro Mortuis Gerenda, on the care of the dead, the various subsequent doctors of the Church, and the broader tradition of intercessory prayer that has shaped Christian practice across centuries, treats the relationship between the living and the dead as a genuine relationship, rather than as a merely psychological projection. The framework does not commit to any specific account of how the relationship operates, with Augustine himself acknowledging in his treatise that the precise mechanism of the relationship is not known. The framework simply affirms that the relationship is real, and that specific practices, including prayer and remembrance, can engage it. The Buddhist tradition has developed its own substantial framework for understanding what happens to consciousness after biological death, with the Tibetan Buddhist tradition having articulated this framework with particular precision through the Bardo Thodol, or Tibetan Book of the Dead. The framework, attributed in the tradition to the 8th century Indian master Padmasambhava and transmitted through the Tibetan Buddhist lineages, holds that consciousness passes through specific intermediate states after biological death, with each state having its own characteristics and offering specific possibilities for liberation or for continued existence in subsequent forms. The framework has been developed extensively across more than 1,000 years of Tibetan Buddhist practice, with the broader tradition providing substantial resources for engaging with the question of what happens to consciousness after biological death. The framework does not directly address the question of whether the dead can hear the living, but the framework provides a context within which the question can be addressed. The convergence is not equivalence. The Christian framework of the communion of saints is not the Buddhist framework of the Bardo, is not the Hindu framework of the paths of consciousness. Each tradition is doing its own work, with its own commitments, in its own cultural and theological context. The convergence is not proof of anything. The convergence does not establish that the traditions are correct or that the merely materialist framework is incorrect. What the convergence establishes is that the question of whether the dead can still hear the living is not a question that the merely materialist framework has settled to the satisfaction of careful inquirers across thousands of years. The question remains open. The traditions have developed substantial resources for engaging with the question, and the contemporary research on consciousness and the foundations of physics has begun to develop its own resources for engaging with the question. The next stage of the inquiry will examine what these resources actually suggest, and the stage after that will examine what the great traditions have articulated in their own different vocabularies about whether the dead remain accessible to the living, who remain behind. The body that reads these words has, perhaps, lost someone who was loved. The loss may have been recent. The loss may have been many years ago. The experience of the loss continues, in some form, regardless of how much time has passed since the biological event of death. The question of whether the person who was loved continues to exist in some form, and whether they remain accessible to you in some way, is a question that you have likely asked at some point during the experience of the loss. The question is not a question that this inquiry can definitively answer. The question is a question that the inquiry can help you think through more carefully, with attention to what the actual research suggests, what the actual philosophical frameworks suggest, and what the great traditions of the world have articulated across thousands of years. What you have learned in this preliminary stage is that the phenomenon of sensed presence in the bereaved is real, documented across half a century of careful research, consistent across cultures and contexts, and not adequately explained by any single interpretation that the current state of research has produced. The materialist account has substantial resources, but it does not exhaust the question. The psychological persistence framework accommodates the phenomenology, but it does not commit to claims that exceed what current research can establish. The speculative interpretation takes the phenomenology seriously, but it requires theoretical extensions that current research has not definitively confirmed. Each interpretation has its own strengths. None can be eliminated. The choice among them is, ultimately, yours to make. Whether the dead can still hear you is a question that you will ultimately have to answer for yourself. What this inquiry can offer is the resources for engaging with the question, with the kind of seriousness and care that the question deserves. The next stage of the inquiry will examine what contemporary physics suggests about the possibility that consciousness has features that exceed the merely materialist framework, with particular attention to frameworks that have implications for understanding what may persist of consciousness after biological death. If death is the complete cessation that ordinary experience suggests it is, then the documented phenomena that the previous stage of the inquiry examined are entirely products of brain processes that operate within the bereaved. The materialist framework is sufficient, the question is settled, the inquiry can stop here. But contemporary physics has produced several frameworks that complicate this picture in specific ways. The frameworks do not establish that the dead can hear the living. The frameworks do not establish that consciousness persists in any specific form after biological death. The frameworks establish that the question of what happens at death is more complicated than the merely materialist framework suggests. With the complications arising from features of physical reality that contemporary research has documented but not yet fully understood, what follows is an examination of these frameworks, with particular attention to what they actually claim and to what remains genuinely speculative about their implications. None of these frameworks should be taken as evidence that the dead can hear the living. All of these frameworks should be taken as evidence that the question of what happens at death is not as settled as the merely materialist framework would suggest. Whether you find any of these considerations relevant to your own engagement with loss is a question that you will need to answer for yourself. The first framework that bears on the inquiry is what physicists call the block universe interpretation of relativity. The framework, developed initially through the work of Hermann Minkowski in 1908, and elaborated subsequently by various physicists and philosophers including Hilary Putnam and Brian Greene, derives from the implications of special and general relativity for the relationship between time and reference frames. The basic insight of the framework is that different observers moving at different velocities have different definitions of what counts as simultaneous, with the implications for any privilege present being substantial. If your now and my now can be different, and if both have equal claim to being real, then the universe contains all of time rather than only a moving present that flows from past to future. The specific argument that produced the block universe framework deserves careful attention because of the rigor of its derivation. Special relativity, as Albert Einstein developed it in 1905, established that the speed of light is the same for all observers regardless of their motion. The consequence of this fact, worked out in detail by Minkowski and subsequent physicists, is that simultaneity is relative. Two events that one observer considers simultaneous will not be simultaneous for another observer moving at a different velocity. The implications for the structure of time are profound. If simultaneity is relative, then there is no universal present moment that is the same for all observers. The present that you experience is your present, defined relative to your specific frame of reference. The present that someone moving at a different velocity experiences is their present, defined relative to their specific frame of reference. The two presents are equally real, but they are different presents. The Putnam argument, articulated by the American philosopher Hilary Putnam in his 1967 paper Time and Physical Geometry, extended this insight in a specific direction. Putnam argued that if simultaneity is relative, then events that are simultaneous in some reference frame are real in that frame, and therefore real simpliciter, regardless of whether they are simultaneous in any other frame. The argument implies that all events that are simultaneous with some observer somewhere are real, which when applied to the entire universe implies that all events at all times are real. The argument has been controversial among philosophers of physics, with various responses being developed. But the argument has been influential in establishing the block universe framework as a serious option among the available interpretations of relativity. The block universe framework treats space-time as a four-dimensional structure within which all of time exists with equal reality. The past has not ceased to exist. The future has not yet to come into existence. The past and the future are equally real with the present, with the apparent flow of time being a feature of conscious experience rather than a feature of the underlying physical structure. The framework has been the subject of extensive debate within philosophy of physics, with various critics arguing that the framework involves philosophical extensions that go beyond what the physics strictly requires. The framework is one available interpretation of the implications of relativity, not the only possible interpretation, but the framework is taken seriously by major physicists and major philosophers, with the broader debate continuing to develop. The implications of the block universe framework for understanding death are striking, and they need to be stated with care. If the past exists with equal reality to the present in the broader space-time structure, then the persons who have died have not simply ceased to exist. They exist in the past portions of space-time that the block universe framework treats as equally real with the present portion. The moments of their lives are still there, not in some metaphorical sense, but in the literal four-dimensional structure that the framework articulates. This does not mean that they can hear you. The framework does not establish any specific mechanism through which past portions of space-time could communicate with present portions. The framework simply establishes that the past has not ceased in the way that ordinary thinking assumes it has. What this means for understanding death is one of the questions that the broader inquiry has to address. The framework has implications that bear on how the experience of grief should be understood. If the persons who have died still exist in the past portions of space-time, then the relationships that the bereaved had with them are not relationships that ended with the death. The relationships are relationships that existed across the periods when both parties were alive in the same temporal region, with the relationships being permanent features of the broader space-time structure, rather than being eliminated by the death of one of the parties. The framework does not establish that the bereaved can access the past portions in any specific way. The framework establishes that the relationships are still there, not as memories within the bereaved's brain, but as features of the space-time structure that contains both parties. Whether this distinction matters for how grief should be engaged is a question that each bereaved person has to answer for themselves. The block universe framework is a theory. The framework is not the established consensus interpretation of relativity. The framework has been criticized by various physicists and philosophers who argue that the framework involves metaphysical commitments that exceed what the physics actually requires. The framework is one available interpretation among several, with the question of which interpretation is correct remaining genuinely open. What can be said with certainty is that the framework is taken seriously by major researchers in the field, that the framework has resources for thinking about the relationship between time and death that exceed what the merely sequential framework allows, and that the framework should be considered as one possibility among several rather than as established fact. The second framework that bears on the inquiry is the orchestrated objective reduction theory of consciousness developed by Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff. The framework, which we have examined in connection with other inquiries, holds that consciousness arises through specific quantum processes in microtubules within neurons, with the moment-to-moment generation of conscious experience involving the orchestrated collapse of quantum states through gravitational mechanisms operating at the fundamental level of physical reality. The framework has received some empirical support through the research of Anirban Bandyopadhyay at the National Institute for Materials Science in Japan, and through the 2024 research of Mike Wiest at Wellesley College on the effects of microtubule stabilizing anesthetics on consciousness. The framework remains controversial within mainstream neuroscience, but the framework continues to develop and to attract serious attention. The specific structure of the Penrose-Hameroff framework deserves attention because of its sophistication. Penrose argued, in his books The Emperor's New Mind in 1989 and Shadows of the Mind in 1994, that the standard computational account of consciousness cannot adequately account for several specific features of conscious experience. These features include the apparent capacity of consciousness to engage with mathematical truths that are not algorithmically derivable from any specific set of axioms, the unified subjective character of conscious experience that integrates multiple sources of information into a single felt whole, and the specific temporal structure of consciousness that involves the moment-to-moment generation of experience rather than the continuous flow that classical computation would produce. The framework that Penrose developed treats consciousness as involving quantum processes that operate beyond what classical computation can capture, with the specific quantum processes being subject to a form of collapse that Penrose called objective reduction, governed by gravitational effects at the fundamental level of spacetime structure. The collaboration between Penrose and Stuart Hameroff added a specific biological substrate to the framework. Hameroff, an anesthesiologist whose research had focused on the cellular structures of neurons, proposed that microtubules within neurons might be the specific location where the quantum processes that Penrose had identified take place. Microtubules are protein structures that constitute the cytoskeleton of all eukaryotic cells, with neurons containing particularly elaborate microtubule structures. The collaboration between Penrose and Hameroff produced the orchestrated objective reduction theory, with a framework holding that the moment-to-moment generation of conscious experience involves the orchestrated collapse of quantum states in microtubules through the gravitational mechanism that Penrose had identified. The implications of the Penrose-Hameroff framework for understanding what happens to consciousness at biological death are interesting, but need to be stated with care. The framework treats consciousness as associated with quantum coherent states in microtubules. The framework treats the moment-to-moment generation of conscious experience as involving the orchestrated collapse of these quantum states. The framework does not directly address what happens to the quantum information associated with these states when the biological substrate ceases to function. The framework leaves this question open. Penrose and Hameroff themselves have suggested in some publications that the quantum information may not simply cease with the biological death, but they have been careful to mark such suggestions as speculative extensions of the framework rather than as definitive claims that the framework establishes. The empirical support for the Penrose-Hameroff framework deserves attention because of its implications for evaluating the framework's broader claims. The research of Anirban Bandyopadhyay at the National Institute for Materials Science in Japan has documented quantum coherent vibrations in microtubules under physiologically relevant conditions. The findings, published in various peer-reviewed papers, have established that microtubules exhibit the kinds of quantum behaviors that the framework would predict. The 2024 research of Mike Wiest at Wellesley College examined the effects of microtubule stabilizing anesthetics on consciousness in animal models, with the findings documenting that anesthetics that bind specifically to microtubules produce effects on consciousness that are consistent with the predictions of the framework. The empirical support has been controversial, with various critics raising concerns about the specific conditions under which the measurements were made, but the support has continued to develop and to motivate continued engagement with the framework. The careful position with respect to the Penrose-Hameroff framework and its implications for death is to recognize what the framework actually claims and what remains genuinely speculative. The framework claims that consciousness involves specific quantum processes in microtubules. The framework claims that these processes are governed by gravitational mechanisms at the fundamental level. The framework does not claim that the quantum information persists after biological death in any specific form. The suggestion that the information may persist is a speculative extension that goes beyond what the framework strictly establishes. Whether this speculative extension has merit is a question that current research cannot answer definitively. The extension is consistent with the framework. The extension is not required by the framework. Whether you find the extension compelling depends on what considerations you take to be most important in evaluating speculative extensions of established frameworks. The Penrose-Hameroff framework is a theory. The framework is not the established consensus account of consciousness within mainstream neuroscience. The framework has been criticized by various researchers, including Max Tegmark, whose 2000 paper on decoherence in brain microtubules raised serious questions about whether the kind of quantum coherence that the framework requires can be maintained in warm biological systems. Tegmark's argument was that the relevant quantum states would decohere on timescales much shorter than those required for conscious processing, with the implications being that the framework requires quantum coherence to operate where the physics suggests it cannot. The Bandyopadhyay research has provided some response to Tegmark's argument, with the findings suggesting that specific structural features of microtubules may protect against decoherence in ways that the standard treatment had not anticipated. The debate has continued, with the broader framework remaining controversial, but continuing to develop in response to empirical and theoretical challenges. What can be said with certainty is that the framework is taken seriously by serious researchers, that the framework has resources for thinking about consciousness that exceed what the merely classical framework allows, and that the framework should be considered as one possibility among several rather than as established fact. The third framework that bears on the inquiry is the implicate order theory developed by the British physicist David Bohm. The framework, articulated most fully in Bohm's 1980 book Wholeness and the Implicate Order, proposes that the physical reality we ordinarily encounter is an unfolding of a deeper underlying reality through processes that operate according to specific structural principles. The implicate order is, on the framework, the level at which information is distributed across the entire system in a holographic manner, with specific manifestations in the explicate order being unfoldings of patterns that exist in compressed form at the deeper level. Bohm developed the framework in part through engagement with the conceptual problems of quantum mechanics, and in part through engagement with the conceptual problems of relativity, with the broader framework providing one of the most sophisticated philosophical responses to the difficulties of integrating quantum mechanics with gravitational physics. The specific structure of Bohm's framework deserves attention because of its philosophical depth. Bohm proposed that the apparent separation between objects in the explicate order is itself a feature of how the explicate order operates rather than a feature of the deeper implicate order. At the implicate level, all phenomena are interconnected in ways that the explicate level cannot fully capture. The explicate level is, on the framework, a kind of unfolding of patterns that exist in compressed form at the implicate level, with the explicate manifestations being temporary expressions of the deeper patterns rather than the basic level of reality. The framework treats this unfolding and enfolding as a continuous process that Bohm called the hollow movement, with the hollow movement being the fundamental process from which all specific phenomena emerge. The implications of Bohm's framework for understanding death need to be stated with care. The framework holds that the information associated with any specific manifestation in the explicate order is not eliminated when the manifestation ceases. The information is re-enfolded into the implicate order from which the manifestation emerged. The framework treats this as a general principle that applies to all phenomena rather than as a specific claim about consciousness or about death. The application of the principle to the question of what happens to consciousness at biological death is one available implication of the framework, but the application is not required by the framework. Bohm himself was careful in his writings to distinguish what the framework strictly establishes from what speculative extensions of the framework might suggest. The careful position with respect to Bohm's framework is to recognize that the framework provides a structural picture within which the question of what happens to consciousness at biological death can be reformulated, but the framework does not by itself answer the question. The framework treats information as fundamentally preserved at the implicate level, with the explicate manifestations being temporary unfoldings rather than the basic level of reality. If consciousness is associated with information patterns that participate in the implicate order, then biological death may not represent the complete cessation that ordinary thinking assumes. But this is a speculative extension of the framework. The framework does not establish that consciousness participates in the implicate order in any specific way. The framework provides resources for thinking about the possibility, but the resources do not by themselves establish the possibility as actual. Bohm engaged extensively with the Indian philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti across decades of dialogue, with the exchanges between them providing one of the more interesting intersections between contemporary physics and contemplative traditions in the 20th century. The dialogues addressed various themes including consciousness, time, and the relationship between human awareness and physical reality, with Bohm bringing his framework into engagement with traditions that had addressed similar questions from very different methodological perspectives. The dialogues did not produce any specific conclusions about whether consciousness persists after biological death, but the dialogues did demonstrate that the implicate order framework has natural points of contact with contemplative traditions that the contemporary research has not yet fully developed. The Bohm framework is a theory. The framework is not the established consensus interpretation of quantum mechanics. The framework has been criticized by various physicists who argue that the framework introduces hidden variables that go beyond what the physics strictly requires. The framework is one available interpretation among several, with the question of which interpretation is correct remaining genuinely open. What can be said with certainty is that the framework is taken seriously by serious researchers, that the framework has resources for thinking about the relationship between information and physical manifestation that the merely materialist framework cannot offer, and that the framework should be considered as one possibility among several rather than as established fact. The fourth framework that bears on the inquiry is the principle of information conservation that emerged from research on black hole physics. The framework, developed across decades of work by Stephen Hawking, Leonard Susskind, Gerard Hooft, and various other researchers, addresses what happens to the information that falls into black holes. The early Hawking framework had suggested that the information might be lost when black holes evaporate through Hawking radiation, with the implication being that black holes might violate the fundamental principle that information cannot be destroyed. Subsequent work, particularly through the holographic principle and the ADS-CFT correspondence, has produced strong arguments that the information is preserved through specific mechanisms that operate at the boundary of the black hole rather than within its interior. The information conservation principle has become one of the foundational principles in contemporary theoretical physics, with the principle being supported by extensive theoretical work, even as the specific mechanisms remain subject to continued investigation. The the specific development of the information conservation principle deserves attention because of its broader implications. Hawking's original 1976 argument that black holes destroy information was based on his calculation that black holes emit thermal radiation that does not carry information about what fell into the black hole. The argument created what became known as the black hole information paradox, with the paradox being that the apparent destruction of information by black holes conflicts with the fundamental principles of quantum mechanics that information cannot be destroyed. The paradox motivated decades of research on the foundations of physics, with the resolution being one of the central problems in contemporary theoretical physics. The eventual resolution, articulated most fully through the work of Juan Maldacena on the ADS, CFT correspondence, and through the broader development of the holographic principle by 't Hooft and Susskind, established that the information is preserved through specific mechanisms that operate at the boundary of the black hole rather than being destroyed. The implications of information conservation for understanding death need to be stated with extreme care because the application of the principle to biological systems involves substantial theoretical extensions that have not been definitively established. The principle applies to fundamental physics. The principle has been demonstrated through theoretical analysis of specific physical systems, including black holes. The application of the principle to biological systems, including the question of what happens to the information associated with conscious experience at biological death, is a speculative extension that goes beyond what the physics strictly establishes. The information conservation principle does not by itself establish that the information associated with a person's consciousness persists after biological death in any specific form. The principle establishes only that, within fundamental physics, information cannot be destroyed. Whether this principle has any implications for biological death depends on how one interprets the relationship between fundamental physics and biological systems. The careful position with respect to information conservation is to recognize what the principle actually establishes and what remains genuinely speculative. The principle establishes that information cannot be destroyed within fundamental physics. The principle does not establish that the information associated with a person's consciousness persists after biological death in any form that would be relevant to the question of whether the dead can hear the living. The application of the principle to biological systems is a speculative extension. The extension is consistent with the principle. The extension is not required by the principle. Whether you find the extension compelling depends on what considerations you take to be most important in evaluating speculative extensions of established physical principles. The convergence between these four frameworks is striking, and it deserves attention. All four frameworks suggest, in their own different ways, that the cessation that ordinary thinking associates with death may not be as complete as ordinary thinking assumes. The block universe framework suggests that the past portions of space-time that contain the persons who have died are still there. The Penrose-Hameroff framework suggests that consciousness involves quantum processes that may have features extending beyond what classical mechanics allows. The Bohm framework suggests that the information associated with specific manifestations is re-enfolded into a deeper implicate order rather than being eliminated. The information conservation principle suggests that information cannot be destroyed within fundamental physics. Each framework, in its own way, complicates the simple picture of death as complete cessation. The convergence is not proof. The convergence does not establish that the dead continue to exist in any form that would allow them to hear the living. The convergence does not establish that any specific account of what happens at biological death is correct. The convergence establishes only that the question of what happens at biological death is more complicated than the merely materialist framework suggests, with the complications arising from features of physical reality that have been documented but not yet fully understood. The convergence is striking because the four frameworks were developed independently and address different aspects of physical reality, but they arrive at structurally similar implications for understanding the question of cessation. The convergence is a pattern that warrants attention without warranting any specific conclusion. These are theories. They are not proofs. The block universe framework is one available interpretation of relativity among several. The Penrose Hameroff framework is one available account of consciousness among several. The Bohm framework is one available interpretation of quantum mechanics among several. The information conservation principle is well established for fundamental physics, but its application to biological systems is speculative. None of these frameworks establishes that the dead can hear the living. None of these frameworks establishes that consciousness persists in any specific form after biological death. What these frameworks establish is that the question of what happens at biological death is open in ways that the merely materialist framework does not adequately recognize. Whether you find any of these considerations relevant to your own engagement with loss is a question that you will need to answer for yourself. The careful inquirer who has worked through these frameworks is in a different position than the inquirer who began without any familiarity with them. The careful inquirer recognizes that the question of what happens at death is not the settled question that popular discussions often suggest. The careful inquirer recognizes that contemporary physics has produced frameworks that complicate the simple picture of death as complete cessation. The careful inquirer also recognizes that none of these frameworks establishes any specific account of what happens at death, with the question remaining genuinely open. The careful inquirer is, in this respect, more uncertain about the question than the inquirer who began with a confident materialist position or with a confident religious position. The increased uncertainty is itself a kind of progress, because it reflects more accurate engagement with what the actual state of inquiry is, rather than a false confidence in either direction. There is an additional consideration that bears on the broader inquiry. The frameworks that we have examined arose from research that was not primarily concerned with the question of what happens at biological death. The block universe framework arose from research on relativity. The Penrose Hameroff framework arose from research on the nature of consciousness. The Bohm framework arose from research on the foundations of quantum mechanics. The information conservation principle arose from research on black hole physics. The fact that these frameworks, developed for entirely different reasons by entirely different researchers using entirely different methods, all converge on implications that complicate the picture of death, as complete cessation is itself a feature of the broader inquiry that deserves attention. The convergence is not the product of researchers who set out to vindicate religious frameworks. The convergence is the product of careful research into the foundations of physics and the nature of consciousness, with the implications for understanding death being an unintended consequence of the research rather than its purpose. The convergence between these contemporary frameworks and the recognitions that the contemplative traditions have articulated across thousands of years is another feature that deserves attention. The Christian tradition has held for 2,000 years that those who have died in Christ remain part of the living church. The Buddhist tradition has held for more than 2,000 years that consciousness passes through specific intermediate states after biological death. The Hindu tradition has held across an even longer span that consciousness is not the kind of thing that simply ceases with biological death. These traditional recognitions were developed without any access to the contemporary physics that we have been examining. The traditional recognitions and the contemporary frameworks have arrived at structurally similar implications for the question of what happens at death, despite operating within entirely different vocabularies and using entirely different methods. The convergence is striking. The convergence is not proof of anything. The convergence is a pattern that warrants the kind of careful attention that the broader inquiry will give it in the next stage. The careful inquirer at this stage has worked through 4 specific frameworks from contemporary physics, each of which has implications for the question of what happens at biological death. The frameworks are not equivalent to each other. The block universe framework addresses the structure of time. The Penrose Hameroff framework addresses the nature of consciousness. The Bohm framework addresses the foundations of quantum mechanics. The information conservation principle addresses the basic principles of physics. Each framework approaches the question of death from a different angle. The convergence among them on implications that complicate the simple picture of cessation is not the consequence of any single framework's claims, but is a feature that emerges when the various frameworks are considered together. The convergence is more striking because the frameworks were developed for different purposes by different researchers using different methods, with the implications for death being an unintended consequence of the research rather than its purpose. The body that reads these words has, perhaps, lost someone who was loved. The theoretical frameworks that we have been examining do not establish that the person who was loved continues to exist in any form that would allow them to hear you. The frameworks establish only that the question of what happens at biological death is more complicated than the merely materialist framework suggests, with the complications arising from features of physical reality that have been documented but not yet fully understood. Whether any of these complications matter for how you should engage with the experience of loss is a question that you will ultimately have to answer for yourself. What you have learned in this stage is that contemporary physics has produced frameworks that complicate the picture of death as complete cessation. The frameworks are not proofs of any specific religious or spiritual position. The frameworks are not proofs that consciousness persists after biological death. The frameworks are explorations of what physical reality actually involves, with implications for the question of death being one of several consequences of the broader inquiry. Whether you find these implications relevant depends on what considerations you bring to your own engagement with loss. What the inquiry can offer is the resources for engaging with the question with attention to what the actual frameworks of contemporary physics actually establish and what remains genuinely speculative. The next stage of the inquiry will examine what the great contemplative traditions of the world have articulated across thousands of years about whether the dead remain accessible to the living, with attention to the specific ways in which each tradition has approached the question and to the structural convergences and divergences between the traditions. Long before laboratories or theoretical physicists, contemplative thinkers in widely separated cultures arrived at structurally similar positions on the question of whether the dead remain accessible to the living who remain behind. The methods used were not measurement or theoretical analysis in the modern technical sense. The methods used were sustained attention to the human experience of loss, to the experiences of the dying, to the recognitions that emerged in contemplative practice, and to the philosophical reflection on what these experiences and recognitions might mean. What these thinkers found, in their own different vocabularies, is that the relationship between the living and the dead is not the simple relationship of complete separation that ordinary thinking would suggest. The convergence between these contemplative recognitions and the contemporary scientific and philosophical frameworks that we have examined is one of the more striking patterns in the entire history of human thought about consciousness and death. The convergence is not proof. The convergence is not equivalence. Each tradition is doing its own work, with its own commitments, in its own cultural and theological context. What the traditions share, despite these differences, is the recognition that the question of whether the dead can hear the living is not as settled as ordinary thinking assumes, and that careful engagement with the question reveals depths that exceed what the merely sequential framework allows. Whether you find any of these traditional articulations compelling is a question that you will need to answer for yourself. The Christian tradition has developed the most philosophically elaborated framework for thinking about the relationship between the living and the dead through the doctrine of the communion of saints. The doctrine, which has been articulated across 2,000 years of Christian theological reflection, holds that the Church includes not only the living, but also those who have died, and that the various members of this expanded church remain in genuine relationship with each other. The framework treats biological death as a transition rather than as a complete cessation, with the deceased continuing to participate in the broader community of faith through specific structural relationships that the tradition has worked to characterize. The framework has been developed through scriptural reflection, through theological argument, and through the lived practice of intercessory prayer that has shaped Christian devotion across centuries. The scriptural foundations of the communion of saints include several specific passages that have shaped subsequent theological reflection. The 12th chapter of the letter to the Hebrews speaks of the great cloud of witnesses that surrounds the living believers, with the witnesses being understood throughout the tradition as those who have died but who remain present to the living community in some structural sense. The book of Revelation describes the prayers of the saints rising before the throne of God, with the saints in question being not the living but those who have died and who continue to participate in the life of the broader church. The various scriptural passages do not provide a single definitive account of how the relationship between the living and the dead operates, but they provide the foundational material from which subsequent theological reflection has worked. The most philosophically substantial treatment of the question in early Christian thought appears in Augustine of Hippo's treatise, De Cura Pro Mortuis Gerenda, on the care of the dead, written near the end of his life around 421. The treatise was written in response to a question from Bishop Paulinus of Nola about whether burying the dead near the shrines of martyrs would provide spiritual benefit to the deceased. Augustine's response is philosophically careful in ways that have continued to shape Christian thinking about these questions across centuries. Augustine affirms that the dead remain part of the broader community of faith, and that prayer for the dead is meaningful, but he is careful to acknowledge that the precise mechanism through which the dead are aware of the prayers of the living is not known to us. The treatise treats the question of whether the dead can hear the living as a question that the tradition affirms in some form, but that resists definitive specification. Augustine's specific, careful position deserves attention because of its sophistication. He distinguishes between several possible ways in which the dead might be aware of what happens among the living. The dead might be informed by angels who travel between the realms. The dead might learn from those who die later and join them. The dead might have direct knowledge through divine illumination that allows them to perceive what is relevant to their concerns. Augustine does not endorse any specific account, but he treats the possibility of the dead's awareness of the living as something that the tradition affirms, even when the mechanism cannot be specified. The treatise is one of the more careful pieces of philosophical theology in early Christian thought, with the carefulness being one of the reasons that the treatise has continued to be influential across subsequent Christian reflection on these questions. The medieval tradition developed the framework that Augustine had articulated with substantial sophistication. Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, addressed these themes in his Summa Theologiae with characteristic philosophical precision. Aquinas affirmed the doctrine of the communion of saints and the meaningfulness of prayer for and to the dead, while being careful to distinguish what the doctrine actually claims from speculative extensions that exceed what theological argument can establish. The framework that Aquinas developed treats the deceased as participating in the broader community of grace, with the participation involving specific structural relationships that the theological framework can characterize, even when the mechanisms cannot be fully specified. The framework has continued to be influential within Catholic theology, with the broader tradition providing substantial resources for thinking about the question of whether the dead can hear the living. The 14th century Italian poet Dante Alighieri provided one of the most influential literary articulations of the framework through the Divine Comedy. The encounters with the dead that constitute the central narrative of the poem, particularly in the Purgatorio and the Paradiso, treat the relationship between the living and the dead as a relationship that can be cultivated through specific practices, including prayer and intercession. The dead in Dante's framework are not absent from the living. The dead are accessible through the broader structure of the spiritual life that the poem articulates. The framework is poetic rather than systematic theology, but the framework has shaped Christian thinking about these questions across more than 7 centuries since its composition. The convergence between Dante's framework and the contemporary frameworks we examined in the previous stage of the inquiry is striking. The dead are still there, in some form, accessible through specific means. The medieval mystical tradition within Christianity developed the framework in additional directions. The 13th century German mystic Mechthild of Magdeburg, whose visionary writings have been one of the more influential sources within the broader mystical tradition, described specific encounters with the dead that she interpreted as genuine communications across the boundary of biological death. The 14th century English mystic Julian of Norwich addressed these themes in her Revelations of Divine Love, with the framework treating the relationship between the living and the dead as embedded within the broader divine reality that her visions revealed. The 16th century Spanish mystics John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila both addressed these themes in their writings, with the framework treating the cultivation of awareness of the dead as part of the broader spiritual practice that their work articulated. The mystical tradition does not treat the question of whether the dead can hear the living as a question to be settled through philosophical argument. The mystical tradition treats the question as one that opens onto practices that allow for direct experience of the relationship. Mechthild's specific articulations in her work, Das fließende Licht der Gottheit, the flowing light of the Godhead, deserve attention because of their philosophical sophistication. The visions that Mechthild recorded include specific encounters with deceased persons who communicated with her about their state and about the spiritual situation that the encounters revealed. Mechthild was careful to distinguish her own interpretations of these encounters from what she presented as direct communications, with the carefulness being a feature of her work that distinguishes it from less philosophically careful mystical writings. The framework that emerges from her work treats the boundary between the living and the dead as more permeable than ordinary thinking assumes, while remaining careful about what can and cannot be established through such encounters. Julian of Norwich, working in the late 14th century in Norwich, developed her framework through what she described as a series of revelations that came during a severe illness. The framework treats the broader divine reality as containing all created beings in an ongoing relationship that biological death does not sever. The implications for understanding the relationship between the living and the dead follow from the broader framework. The deceased remain within the divine reality that also contains the living, with the relationship being maintained through the divine reality that holds both rather than through any direct mechanism of communication between them. The framework is theologically sophisticated, with the implications for the question of whether the dead can hear the living being more subtle than simpler frameworks would suggest. John of the Cross, the 16th century Spanish mystic whose writings on contemplative prayer have been among the most influential in the Christian tradition, addressed the broader question of how consciousness participates in divine reality during the contemplative life. The framework that emerges from his work treats the relationship with the dead as embedded within the broader relationship with divine reality that the contemplative life cultivates. The framework does not provide a specific mechanism for communication with the deceased. The framework treats the deceased as part of the broader divine reality that the contemplative life engages, with the engagement being possible through specific practices that the tradition has refined across centuries. Teresa of Avila, the contemporary of John of the Cross, whose contributions to Christian mystical thought have been substantial, addressed these themes in her autobiography and in her broader writings on the contemplative life. The framework that Teresa articulated treats specific kinds of encounters with the deceased as possible within the broader contemplative life, while being careful to distinguish such encounters from imagination or projection. Teresa's specific carefulness about evaluating mystical experiences including her insistence that such experiences must be evaluated against Scripture and against the broader tradition rather than accepted at face value, has been one of the more influential contributions to the broader Christian framework for engaging with these questions. The Eastern Christian tradition has developed its own substantial framework for understanding the relationship between the living and the dead, with the framework operating through the broader theological commitments of Orthodox Christianity. The Eastern framework places particular emphasis on the deification of the human person through participation in divine life, with the participation continuing after biological death and providing the structural basis for the ongoing relationship between the living and the dead. The 7th century Byzantine theologian Maximus the Confessor articulated this framework with particular philosophical precision with the broader tradition that has emerged, providing one of the most sophisticated traditional treatments of how consciousness participates in fundamental reality after biological death. The Christian tradition treats the question of whether the dead can hear the living as a theological question, rather than as a question that can be settled through empirical investigation. The tradition affirms that the relationship between the living and the dead is real, and that specific practices can engage it. The tradition is careful to distinguish what is affirmed from what remains speculative. The tradition does not treat the framework as proof of anything in the scientific sense. The framework is a theological framework, operating within the specific commitments of Christian theology, offering an answer to the question that has been refined across 2,000 years of reflection and practice. Whether you find the framework compelling depends on what considerations you bring to your own engagement with the question. The Buddhist tradition has developed its own substantial framework for understanding what happens to consciousness after biological death, with the framework operating within specific commitments about the nature of consciousness that differ in important ways from the Christian framework. The most fully developed Buddhist treatment of the question appears in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition through the Bardo Thodol, often translated into English as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which articulates a framework for understanding the intermediate states that consciousness passes through after biological death. The text, attributed in the tradition to the 8th century Indian master Padmasambhava and transmitted through the Tibetan Buddhist lineages, has been one of the most influential treatments of these questions in human history. The structure of the Bardo Thodol framework deserves careful attention because of its sophistication. The framework identifies 6 specific intermediate states or bardos through which consciousness passes during the broader cycle of existence. The first 3 bardos correspond to states experienced during embodied life, including the bardo of birth and life, the bardo of dream, and the bardo of meditation. The 4th bardo is the bardo of the moment of death itself, when consciousness encounters specific phenomena that the framework characterizes in detail. The 5th bardo is the bardo of dharmata, the period after death in which consciousness encounters the clear light of fundamental reality. The 6th bardo is the bardo of becoming, the period during which consciousness moves toward its next embodiment. The framework treats each bardo as having specific characteristics and offering specific possibilities for liberation, with the entire framework providing a sophisticated articulation of what the tradition understands to happen after biological death. The bardo of the moment of death is described in the Bardo Thodol with particular attention to the experiences that the dying person encounters. The framework holds that consciousness at the moment of biological death encounters the clear light of fundamental reality, with the encounter offering an opportunity for liberation if the consciousness has been prepared through prior contemplative practice. The framework treats the encounter as something that all conscious beings experience at the moment of death, regardless of their religious tradition or spiritual development, with the differences being in the degree to which the consciousness can recognize what it encounters. The framework has implications for understanding what the dying actually experience that the contemporary research on end-of-life experiences may bear on. The bardo of Dharmata that follows the moment of death is described in the Bardo Thodol as a period during which consciousness encounters various phenomena that the framework characterizes in detail. The phenomena include encounters with what the framework describes as peaceful and wrathful deities, with the deities being understood within the tradition as projections of the consciousness itself rather than as external beings. The framework holds that consciousness during this bardo has specific opportunities for recognition that, if cultivated through prior practice, can lead to liberation from the cycle of rebirth. The framework treats this bardo as having specific structural features that the tradition has worked to characterize across centuries, with the framework being one of the more elaborated treatments of the period immediately after biological death in any contemplative tradition. The bardo of becoming that follows is described as the period during which consciousness moves toward its next embodiment. The framework treats consciousness during this bardo as having specific characteristics, including a kind of body that the framework calls the mental body, which is described as more subtle than the physical body and capable of movement that the physical body could not accomplish. The framework holds that consciousness in the bardo of becoming has varying degrees of awareness of the world of the living, with the awareness being most acute during the period immediately following biological death and becoming progressively more attenuated as the bardo unfolds. The framework treats this period as one during which specific practices by the living can have effects on the deceased consciousness, with the effects being part of why the Bardo Thodol is traditionally read to the dying or recently deceased person. The implications of the Bardo framework for understanding whether the dead can hear the living are complex. The framework treats the deceased consciousness as passing through specific states during the period after death, with the consciousness having varying degrees of awareness of the world of the living during these states. The framework holds that the deceased in the early Bardo states can be reached through specific practices, including the reading of the Bardo Thodol itself to the dying or recently deceased person, with the readings providing guidance through the intermediate states. The framework treats the relationship between the living and the dead as one that can be cultivated through specific practices, with the practices having effects on the deceased that the framework characterizes in specific ways. The broader Buddhist framework operates within specific commitments about the nature of consciousness that need to be acknowledged for proper engagement with the framework. The Buddhist tradition rejects the doctrine of a permanent soul or self that persists across the cycle of existence, with the rejection being one of the central distinguishing features of Buddhist thought. What persists, on the Buddhist framework, is not a soul in the Christian sense, but a continuity of consciousness that the tradition characterizes through specific philosophical vocabulary, including the Chitta Santana, the stream of consciousness, and various other technical terms. The continuity is real, but is not a substantial self that simply moves from one form to another. The continuity is more like a candle flame that lights another candle and another after that, with the second flame being neither the same as nor entirely different from the first. The implications of this Buddhist framework for understanding whether the dead can hear the living are subtle. The framework affirms that consciousness continues in some form after biological death. The framework affirms that specific practices can engage with this continued consciousness during the early stages of the bardo. The framework does not affirm that the dead are present in the way that the Christian framework affirms. The continuity that persists is not, on the Buddhist framework, a soul that remains accessible across the life of the bereaved. The continuity passes through the bardo states and moves toward its next embodiment, with the relationship between the deceased consciousness and the previous embodied life becoming progressively more attenuated as the bardo unfolds. The Pure Land tradition within Mahayana Buddhism developed an additional framework that bears on these questions. The tradition, which has been one of the most widely practiced forms of Buddhism in East Asia, holds that those who have died with the appropriate disposition can be reborn in a pure land established by a Buddha, particularly the Pure Land of Amitabha Buddha. The framework treats the deceased who have been reborn in the Pure Land as continuing to exist in specific forms accessible through prayer and intention by the living. The framework has substantial parallels with the Christian framework of the communion of saints, with both frameworks affirming that the deceased remain accessible to the living in some form that specific practices can engage. The frameworks remain distinct in their broader theological commitments, but the structural parallel on the question of accessibility is striking. The contemporary Tibetan Buddhist teacher Sogyal Rinpoche, whose book, The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, has been one of the most influential popular presentations of the Buddhist framework for Western audiences, addressed these themes in ways that brought the traditional framework into engagement with contemporary Western concerns about death and grief. The framework that Sogyal Rinpoche presented treats the relationship between the living and the dead as one that can be cultivated through specific practices that the Buddhist tradition has refined across centuries. The framework does not require the kind of theological commitment that the Christian framework presupposes, with the Buddhist practices being applicable across various religious and non-religious contexts. The Hindu tradition has developed its own substantial framework for understanding the relationship between the living and the dead, with the framework operating within the specific commitments of Hindu philosophy and religious practice. The framework treats biological death as a transition between embodiments rather than as a complete cessation, with the consciousness of the deceased passing through specific states before being reborn in another form. The framework has been articulated through extensive textual tradition, including the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, and various other foundational texts, with the broader tradition providing substantial resources for thinking about the question of whether the dead can hear the living. The specific Hindu framework of the Pretaloka, the realm of the deceased, addresses the question of where the dead exist during the period between embodiments. The framework treats the deceased as passing through this realm before either reaching liberation or being reborn in another embodied form, with the duration of the passage depending on various factors including the spiritual development of the deceased during their previous embodied life. The framework holds that the deceased in the Pretaloka can be reached through specific practices performed by the living, with the practices providing benefit to the deceased and facilitating their movement toward their next state. The Hindu practice of Shraddha, the ritual offerings made to ancestors, embodies the framework in concrete practice. The practice, which has been performed across thousands of years of Hindu religious life, involves specific rituals through which the living provide benefit to the deceased. The framework treats the practice as having actual effects on the deceased, rather than as merely psychological practices for the bereaved. The Pitru Paksha, the period of 2 weeks each year dedicated specifically to ancestor offerings, intensifies the practice during the time that the Hindu calendar identifies as particularly receptive to communications between the living and the dead. The Bhagavad Gita addresses the broader question of consciousness and death in its second chapter with particular philosophical precision. The teaching that Krishna delivers about the eternal nature of the soul, the imperishability of consciousness, and the broader cycle of existence within which death is a transition, rather than a cessation, provides the foundational framework within which subsequent Hindu thinking about these questions has developed. The framework treats consciousness as fundamentally not the kind of thing that simply ceases with biological death, with the implications for understanding the relationship between the living and the dead following from this broader recognition. The specific teaching of the second chapter of the Gita includes the famous verse that holds that just as a person discards worn-out clothing and puts on new clothing, so does the soul discard worn-out bodies and enter new ones. The framework treats the soul or Atman as the genuine identity of the conscious being, with the embodied form being one specific manifestation of the deeper identity that persists across embodiments. The framework has been the subject of extensive philosophical reflection within the various schools of Hindu philosophy, with the specific interpretations varying but the broader recognition being consistent. The implications for understanding whether the deceased can hear the living follow from this broader framework. The deceased Atman has not ceased to exist. The deceased Atman is moving toward its next embodied form. Whether the deceased can hear the living during the period of transition depends on the specific framework of the tradition that one is engaging. The various schools of Hindu philosophy have developed different specific frameworks for understanding what happens during the period between embodiments. The Advaita Vedanta tradition, articulated most fully through the work of the 8th century philosopher Shankara, treats the deeper identity of the conscious being as ultimately one with the broader divine reality, with the implications for understanding the relationship between the living and the dead following from this non-dual framework. The Vishishtadvaita tradition, articulated through the work of the 11th and 12th century philosopher Ramanuja, treats the relationship between the conscious being and divine reality as genuinely relational, with the implications for understanding the relationship between the living and the dead being different in important ways from the Advaita framework. The differences matter for understanding the broader Hindu framework, with the various schools offering different specific accounts of how the question should be understood. The Taoist tradition has developed its own framework for understanding the relationship between the living and the dead, with the framework operating within the specific commitments of Chinese religious and philosophical thought. The framework distinguishes between two souls that the tradition recognizes, the Hun and the Po, with each soul having a different fate after biological death. The Hun, the more spiritual soul, ascends and continues in a specific form. The Po, the more material soul, descends and is associated with the physical remains. The framework treats the relationship between the living and the deceased Hun as one that can be cultivated through specific practices, including ancestor veneration, that has been a central feature of Chinese religious life across thousands of years. The Zhuangzi, the foundational Taoist text composed in the 4th or 3rd century before the Common Era, addressed the theme of death with characteristic philosophical depth. The text contains the famous passage in which Zhuangzi, having been told of the death of his wife, was found by his friend Hui Shi singing and beating on a tub. When Hui Shi expressed shock at this behavior, Zhuangzi explained that he had recognized that his wife's death was part of the broader transformation of all things, with the transformation being something to be received rather than mourned in the conventional sense. The framework treats death as integral to the broader Tao that operates throughout reality, with the implications for understanding the relationship between the living and the dead following from this broader recognition. The Chinese practice of ancestor veneration that has been central to Chinese religious life across thousands of years embodies the broader Taoist and Confucian framework in concrete practice. The practice involves specific rituals through which the living engage with the deceased ancestors, with the rituals being treated as having actual effects on the deceased rather than as merely psychological practices for the bereaved. The framework that supports the practice operates within the broader commitments of Chinese religious thought, with the specific theological foundations differing from the frameworks of Christianity, Buddhism, and Hinduism that we have examined, but with the structural recognition that the deceased remain accessible through specific practices being similar across these widely separated traditions. The Islamic tradition has developed a framework for understanding the period between biological death and the final resurrection through the concept of the barzakh, the intermediate realm where the deceased remain until the final judgment. The framework holds that the deceased in the barzakh have specific kinds of awareness, with various Islamic traditions developing more or less elaborated accounts of what this awareness involves. The framework is one example of the broader pattern in which religious traditions have developed specific accounts of what happens to consciousness during the period after biological death, with the accounts varying in their specific commitments while sharing the recognition that the period is not the complete cessation that ordinary thinking would suggest. What emerges across these various traditions, despite their substantial theological differences and despite developing across widely separated cultures, is a structural recognition that the question of whether the dead can hear the living is not as settled as the merely materialist framework would suggest. The traditions consistently treat biological death as a transition rather than as a complete cessation. The traditions consistently develop practices for engaging with the deceased in ways that the frameworks treat as having actual effects rather than as merely psychological practices for the bereaved. The traditions consistently locate the deceased within broader frameworks of meaning that connect the individual experience of loss to the larger patterns of reality that conscious existence participates in. The convergence between these traditions, and between the traditions and the contemporary scientific and philosophical frameworks that we examined in the previous stage of the inquiry, is striking. The convergence is not equivalence. The Christian framework of the communion of saints is not. The Buddhist framework of the Bardo is not. The Hindu framework of the Pritaloka is not. The Taoist framework of the Hun and Po. Each tradition is doing its own work with its own commitments. The vocabularies differ. The metaphysical frameworks differ profoundly. What they share, despite these differences, is the recognition that biological death is not the complete cessation that the merely materialist framework would suggest, and that the relationship between the living and the dead is not the simple relationship of separation that ordinary thinking assumes. The traditions do not establish that the dead can hear the living in any scientific sense. The traditions affirm that the relationship between the living and the dead is real, in the specific senses that each tradition characterizes, but the affirmations are theological affirmations within specific religious frameworks, rather than empirical claims that current research can verify. The convergence among the traditions is striking. The convergence is not proof of anything. The convergence is a pattern that warrants attention without warranting any specific conclusion. The traditions, taken together with the contemporary research and philosophical frameworks that we have examined, provide resources for engaging with the question of whether the dead can hear the living that exceed what the merely materialist framework can offer. Whether you find these resources compelling depends on what considerations you bring to your own engagement with the question. The next stage of the inquiry will examine what these recognitions, taken together with the contemporary research and the convergence among the traditions, suggest for how a person can engage with the experience of loss while remaining honest about what is established and what remains speculative. The question of whether the dead can hear the living is not a question that this inquiry can definitively answer. The question is not a question that the current state of science can definitively answer. The question is not a question that any of the great contemplative traditions can definitively prove. What this inquiry has done across its previous stages is to examine what is actually known, what is reasonably believed, what is genuinely speculative, and what the great traditions of the world have articulated across thousands of years about this question. The convergences between the contemporary research, the theoretical frameworks of contemporary physics, and the great contemplative traditions are striking enough to warrant careful attention. The convergences are not proof of anything. What follows is the synthesis of what the inquiry has examined, with attention to what the convergences actually suggest, to what objections honest investigation has to acknowledge, and to what specific implications follow for how a bereaved person can engage with the experience of loss, while remaining honest about what is established and what remains genuinely open. Before drawing out the implications, intellectual honesty requires examining the objections to everything that has been argued. The picture we have built is not the only available reading of the evidence, and several alternative views have serious philosophical and scientific defenders. Any account that ignores them is a form of intellectual cheating. The first and most important objection comes from the materialist framework that has been the dominant position within mainstream neuroscience and philosophy of mind. The framework holds that all the documented phenomena that we have examined throughout the inquiry including the sensed presence experiences in the bereaved, the deathbed visions of the dying, and the continuing bonds that the bereaved cultivate with the deceased, are products of brain processes that operate entirely within the conscious individual rather than perceptions of any external reality. The framework has substantial empirical support in the Blanke research on the temporoparietal junction, the O'Connor research on the grieving brain, the Friston framework of predictive processing, and various other contemporary neuroscientific findings. The framework treats the convergent reports of these phenomena across cultures and across centuries as evidence of consistent neurological mechanisms rather than as evidence of consistent perceptions of an external reality. The framework has the resources to explain the phenomena entirely within its own commitments without requiring any theoretical extensions. The honest acknowledgement is that the materialist framework cannot be summarily dismissed. The neural correlates of the phenomena are real correlates. The biological basis of grief and of dying experiences is increasingly characterized. The cognitive functions that these experiences accomplish are documented through extensive research. What the inquiry has established is that the materialist framework does not exhaust what the documented phenomena involve with the qualitative character of the experiences, the consistency of the experiences across cultures, and the broader question of what the phenomena actually mean, all raising features that the merely materialist account does not adequately address. The position that the experiences are reducible to neural activity is not the established scientific consensus that some popular accounts have presented it as. The position is one available framework among several, with serious empirical and philosophical considerations that current research has not fully resolved. The second objection focuses on the speculative status of the philosophical and physical frameworks that we have considered. The block universe interpretation of relativity, while taken seriously by major physicists and philosophers, has not been established as the correct interpretation of the physical reality that relativity describes. The Penrose-Hameroff orchestrated objective reduction theory, while supported by some recent empirical work, remains controversial within the broader neuroscience community. The Bohm framework of the implicate order, while philosophically sophisticated, has not been established as the correct interpretation of quantum mechanics. The application of the information conservation principle to biological systems is a speculative extension that goes beyond what the physics strictly establishes. The honest acknowledgement is that the frameworks provide resources for thinking about consciousness and death beyond the materialist framework. But the frameworks do not by themselves establish that consciousness persists after biological death in any specific form. The third objection requires direct examination of the popular industry that has built itself around the question of whether the dead can hear the living, because the industry has produced substantial harm to vulnerable people, and the careful inquiry has to acknowledge this harm rather than ignoring it. The popular medium industry, which includes various individuals who claim to be able to communicate with deceased loved ones on behalf of the bereaved, has been extensively investigated and consistently found to use specific techniques that have been documented in detail by skeptical researchers. The techniques include what researchers have called cold reading, in which the practitioner uses general statements and observes the reactions of the client to refine subsequent statements, and the Barnum effect, in which general statements that could apply to almost anyone are interpreted by the client as specifically accurate. The work of researchers, including James Randi, has documented these techniques across decades of investigation, with the documentation establishing that the apparent communications produced by the medium industry are products of specific psychological techniques rather than perceptions of any external reality. The specific techniques that the medium industry uses deserve direct examination because the techniques are not obvious to those who encounter them for the first time. Cold reading involves the practitioner beginning with statements that could apply broadly, then observing the client's verbal and non-verbal responses to refine subsequent statements. The technique is built around the cognitive bias toward remembering the specific, accurate statements while forgetting the general statements that did not apply, with the client retrospectively assembling an impression of accurate communication that the actual session did not contain. Hot reading involves the practitioner gathering specific information about the client before the session through various means, then presenting the information during the session as if it had been received from the deceased. The Barnum effect involves the use of statements that are subjectively accurate for almost anyone, with the client interpreting the universal applicability as evidence of specific accuracy. These techniques, taken together, can produce sessions that feel genuinely communicative to the client without involving any actual communication from anyone outside the session. The specific harm that the medium industry has produced deserves direct examination, because the harm continues to operate and continues to affect vulnerable people. The industry has been used to extract substantial financial resources from bereaved persons through sessions that promise communication with deceased loved ones, with the documented costs in some cases having amounted to substantial portions of the bereaved person's savings. The industry has been used to interfere with healthy grief processing by encouraging dependence on continued sessions rather than the cultivation of healthy continuing bonds. The industry has been used to communicate fabricated messages from deceased persons that may have included specific harmful instructions or specific harmful information that the bereaved acted upon. There have been documented cases in which mediums have communicated messages purporting to be from deceased children to grieving parents, with the messages containing specific claims that the parents subsequently discovered to be false. The harm is real and continuing, and the careful inquiry has to acknowledge this harm rather than treating the popular industry as a legitimate engagement with the question of whether the dead can hear the living. The careful position requires distinguishing the medium industry from the genuine traditions that we examined in the previous stage of the inquiry. The Christian doctrine of the communion of saints is not a medium practice. The Catholic and Orthodox traditions of intercessory prayer for the dead are not medium practices. The Buddhist traditions of bardo guidance and metta-meditation directed toward the deceased are not medium practices. The Hindu practices of Shraddha and ancestor offering are not medium practices. The traditional practices operate within specific theological commitments and have been developed across thousands of years of careful reflection. The medium industry has emerged in the past 2 centuries primarily as a commercial enterprise, with the specific techniques being designed to produce convincing performances rather than to engage with any genuine question about what happens after death. The distinction matters. The traditions deserve engagement on their own terms. The industry deserves the kind of skeptical investigation that researchers, including Randy, have provided. The 4th objection concerns the related popular phenomenon of electronic voice phenomena, often abbreviated as EVP, in which various individuals have claimed to capture communications from deceased persons through audio recording equipment. The phenomenon has been investigated extensively across decades, with the investigations consistently finding that the apparent communications are products of audio pareidolia, the same psychological tendency that causes people to see faces in random patterns and to hear meaningful words in random sounds. The research has documented that the same audio recordings, played to different listeners with different framings, produce different interpretations of what the recordings supposedly say, with the interpretations being shaped by the framings rather than by anything actually present in the recordings. The phenomenon has been featured prominently in various forms of popular entertainment and has been used to support various claims about communication with the dead, but the phenomenon does not survive the kind of rigorous investigation that distinguishes genuine perception from psychological projection. The 5th objection concerns the related popular framework that treats various coincidental events as signs from deceased loved ones. The framework, which has been articulated across various popular books and online materials, holds that specific events, including the appearance of butterflies, birds, or other natural phenomena, The recurrence of meaningful numbers or dates, or the occurrence of unexpected reminders of the deceased, should be interpreted as deliberate communications from the deceased. The framework has substantial appeal for the bereaved because it provides a sense of continued connection with the deceased, but the framework has substantial problems that careful inquiry has to acknowledge. The phenomena that the framework identifies as signs are typically common events that occur frequently in ordinary life, with the bereaved noticing them because of the cognitive bias towards seeking meaningful patterns during periods of grief. The interpretation of the events as deliberate communications requires the assumption that the deceased has both the capacity and the motivation to produce specific events in the world of the living, which is an assumption that none of the established traditions and none of the contemporary frameworks actually supports. The framework operates through pareidolia and confirmation bias rather than through any genuine evidence of communication. The careful position is not the dismissal of all engagement with the experience of the deceased's continued presence. The continuing bonds framework that we examined in the first stage of the inquiry provides resources for engaging with the experience that does not require the kind of metaphysical claims that the popular signs framework involves. The traditional practices that we examined in the previous stage provide resources for engaging with the experience within specific theological frameworks. The contemporary research and philosophical frameworks provide resources for thinking about the experience without requiring claims that exceed what the evidence supports. What the careful inquiry rejects is not the experience itself, but the specific, popular frameworks that have built themselves around the experience in ways that exploit the vulnerability of the bereaved. The sixth objection concerns the technical challenges to the Penrose-Hameroff framework that we have examined throughout the inquiry. The Tegmark argument from 2000, which holds that warm biological systems cannot maintain the kind of quantum coherence that the framework requires, has been one of the more substantial technical challenges to the framework. The Bandyopadhyay research has provided some response to Tegmark's argument, but the response has been contested and the broader framework remains controversial. If the Penrose-Hameroff framework is incorrect, then the speculative extension that suggests that consciousness may persist after biological death loses its specific theoretical foundation. The implications for the broader inquiry are substantial, with the entire speculative interpretation that we examine depending on the framework having more theoretical merit than its critics have allowed. The seventh objection concerns the relationship between the various contemplative traditions whose articulations the inquiry has examined. The traditions are not equivalent, and treating them as if they were equivalent does violence to the specific commitments of each. The Christian framework of the communion of saints, with its specific commitments about the relationship between human persons and divine reality, is not the same as the Buddhist framework of the Bardo, with its specific commitments about the absence of a permanent soul and the continuity of consciousness as a stream rather than as a substantial self. The Hindu framework of the Pretaloka, with its specific commitments about the eternal nature of the Atman, is not the same as the Taoist framework of the Hun and Po, with its specific commitments about the two souls that the tradition recognizes. The differences matter. The differences are not surface features that can be dissolved into a common essence without losing what each tradition is actually saying. The honest engagement requires acknowledging the differences while also acknowledging the structural parallels. When all of these objections have been weighed, what survives is not a metaphysical certainty, but a structural picture that holds up under examination. The documented phenomena are real. The materialist framework can account for them, but does not necessarily exhaust what they involve. The speculative frameworks in contemporary physics provide resources for alternative interpretations, but do not establish them. The contemplative traditions have articulated structurally parallel positions across thousands of years, but do not prove them. The convergences are striking. The convergences are not proof. The question of whether the dead can hear the living remains genuinely open, with the openness being the honest acknowledgement of what current inquiry can and cannot establish. The picture has connections to many other strands of inquiry that have been pursued in this larger investigation. The recognition that consciousness involves features that may exceed the merely materialist framework has been examined in the inquiries on what happens to consciousness at biological death, on how memory operates within and beyond brain-based storage, on what meaningful coincidences may suggest about the deeper structure of reality, on what suffering reveals about the conditions of conscious existence, and on how love operates as the bond that connects conscious beings across the broader structures of reality. The current inquiry into whether the dead can hear the living draws on all of these previous inquiries and extends them in a specific direction. The implications for understanding the broader experience of being conscious in a world where loss is one of the central features are substantial. The previous inquiry into what happens to consciousness at biological death examined frameworks including the Penrose-Hameroff orchestrated objective reduction theory, the implications of biological substrate cessation for quantum information, and the various contemplative traditions that have addressed the question of what consciousness becomes after death. The current inquiry extends those considerations toward the specific question of whether the deceased remain accessible to the living. The two inquiries address different aspects of the same broader question. The previous inquiry focused on what happens to the deceased consciousness. The current inquiry focuses on the relationship between the deceased consciousness and the consciousness of the living. The two inquiries together provide a more complete picture than either alone. The recognition that memory may involve features that exceed what the merely brain-based storage framework allows has direct connections to the current inquiry. The work on holographic models of memory developed by Karl and David Bohm provides resources for thinking about how the bereaved continue to have access to detailed information about the deceased through what appears to be ongoing relationship rather than mere stored memory. The framework suggests that memory may operate through participation in informational structures that exceed the merely local brain-based storage, with the implications for understanding the continued presence of the deceased in the bereaved's experience following from the broader framework. The framework remains speculative, but it provides resources for thinking about what the felt continuing presence of the deceased may involve. The recognition that the bond between persons involves features that exceed what the merely psychological framework allows has direct connections to the question of whether the dead can hear the living. The work of Mary Frances O'Connor on the grieving brain has documented that the neural circuits that operated to maintain the attachment during the life of the beloved continue to operate after the death, with the implications being that the bond is not the kind of thing that the death of one party can simply eliminate. Whether this means anything beyond the persistence of neural circuits within the bereaved is a question that the materialist framework treats as having a clear negative answer. The various speculative frameworks that we examined provide resources for thinking about the question differently, with the implications for understanding loss being different on different frameworks. The recognition that meaningful coincidences may have a structural basis that the standard frameworks cannot adequately address has connections to the current inquiry. The popular framework that treats meaningful coincidences during grief as signs from the deceased should not be confused with the more careful consideration of whether the structural patterns that emerge during periods of loss may have features that exceed mere statistical accident. The careful position recognizes both that the popular signs framework has substantial problems and that the broader question of what meaningful coincidences might suggest remains genuinely open within careful inquiry. The two positions are not the same. The careful inquirer can reject the popular signs framework while remaining open to the broader question that the framework distorts. The recognition that consciousness may involve gravitational mechanisms operating at the fundamental level of physical reality has connections to the current inquiry. The Penrose-Hameroff framework, taken together with the broader frameworks of contemporary physics that we have examined, provides resources for thinking about what may happen to the quantum information associated with consciousness at biological death. The framework does not establish that the information persists in any specific form. The framework establishes that the question of what happens to the information is open in ways that the merely classical framework does not adequately recognize. The implications for understanding whether the deceased can have any form of continued awareness, and whether such awareness could be related to the living, follow from the broader framework even if they cannot be established by it. The recognition that suffering has structural features that exceed what the merely physiological framework allows has connections to the current inquiry. Grief is a form of suffering, and the broader question of what suffering reveals about the structure of conscious existence has implications for understanding what loss specifically involves. The neural mechanisms documented in the work on social pain by Naomi Eisenberger establish that the suffering of loss is structurally continuous with the suffering of physical pain, with the implications being that grief is not merely a psychological response to an external event, but is a genuine form of pain that operates through the same neural systems as physical injury. The framework provides resources for thinking about why the loss of a beloved person produces the specific kind of suffering it produces, with the implications for understanding the bereaved's continued engagement with the deceased following from the broader framework. The recognition that time may not have the structure that ordinary perception suggests has direct connections to the current inquiry. The block universe interpretation of relativity, if it is correct, suggests that the persons who have died exist in the past portions of space-time that the framework treats as equally real with the present. The framework does not establish any mechanism through which past portions could communicate with present portions, but the framework does establish that the simple picture of the deceased as having ceased to exist is more problematic than ordinary thinking assumes. The implications for understanding the relationship between the living and the dead follow from the broader framework. These traditions, taken together with the contemporary research and the philosophical frameworks, converge on a practical orientation that bears on how a bereaved person can engage with the experience of loss, while remaining honest about what is established and what remains speculative. The orientation does not require commitment to any specific religious or philosophical framework. The orientation involves the cultivation of specific practices that have been refined across various traditions and that have been documented to be associated with healthy adaptation to loss in contemporary research. There are particular practices that have emerged across the various traditions and that contemporary research has identified as beneficial for the bereaved. The first is the cultivation of continuing bonds with the deceased through practices that the contemporary research has documented and that the contemplative traditions have refined across centuries. The framework articulated by Klass, Silverman, and Nickman in their 1996 book treats the maintenance of an ongoing relationship with the deceased as one of the principal means by which healthy adaptation to loss can be cultivated. The practices include speaking about the deceased with others who knew them, maintaining specific physical objects associated with the deceased, preserving rituals and practices that had been shared with the deceased during their life, and allowing the felt presence of the deceased to be part of the ongoing experience of life, rather than being suppressed or denied. The practices do not require commitment to any specific metaphysical position about what happens after death. The practices simply involve the cultivation of the ongoing relationship that healthy grief allows. A second practice draws on the Christian tradition of intercessory prayer for the deceased, which has been articulated within both the Catholic and the Orthodox traditions across centuries. The practice involves specific forms of prayer in which the living engage with the deceased through the broader divine reality that the tradition affirms. The practice does not require any specific mechanism through which the deceased become aware of the prayers, with the tradition being careful to acknowledge that the precise mechanism cannot be specified. The practice involves the engagement with the deceased through the broader theological framework with the engagement being treated as having actual significance within the framework, rather than as merely psychological exercise for the bereaved. The practice has been refined across 2,000 years of Christian devotional life, with the broader tradition providing substantial resources for the kind of engagement that the practice involves. The practice does not require participation in any specific institutional form of Christianity, with adaptations of the practice being possible across various religious and non-religious contexts. A third practice draws on the Buddhist tradition of metta meditation, often translated as loving kindness meditation, directed toward the deceased. The practice involves the cultivation of specific intentional states directed toward the deceased, with the states including wishes for the deceased's peace and well-being and the cultivation of awareness of the ongoing relationship. The framework that supports the practice operates within specific Buddhist commitments about the nature of consciousness and the bardo states through which consciousness passes after biological death, but the practice itself can be conducted without commitment to these specific frameworks. The practice has parallels with the Christian framework of intercessory prayer, with both practices involving specific forms of engagement with the deceased through cultivated intentional states. The practice has been documented in contemporary research to be associated with various beneficial effects for the practitioner, including reduced grief intensity and increased sense of meaningful connection with the deceased. A fourth practice draws on the Hindu tradition of Shraddha and the broader framework of ancestor remembrance. The practice involves specific forms of remembrance and engagement with the deceased through ritual practices that have been refined across thousands of years of Hindu religious life. The practice does not require commitment to the specific theological framework within which the Hindu tradition has developed the practice. The practice involves the cultivation of awareness of the ongoing presence of the deceased in the broader pattern of one's own life, with the cultivation being conducted through specific practices that have been refined across centuries. Adaptations of the practice can be conducted within various religious and non-religious contexts, with the underlying recognition being that the deceased remain part of the broader pattern that constitutes one's life, and that this remaining can be cultivated through specific practices. A fifth practice draws on the broader pattern of remembrance that operates across many traditions, including the Taoist and Confucian Chinese tradition, the Jewish tradition of saying Kaddish for the deceased, and various other practices that the great traditions have developed. The practice involves the simple act of regular remembrance of the deceased, conducted with specific attention to the ongoing relationship, rather than as merely the cultivation of memory in the cognitive sense. The practice does not require commitment to any specific religious framework. The practice involves the cultivation of awareness that the deceased remain part of one's life in some form, with the form being, whatever the careful inquirer concludes, is most accurate based on their own engagement with the available evidence and frameworks. The practice has been documented in contemporary research to be associated with healthy adaptation to loss across the entire span of the bereaved's remaining life. These practices are simple, but they accumulate. Practiced over time, they shift the relationship between the bereaved and the experience of loss. The relationship becomes less an active resistance to the death of the beloved and more a cultivated engagement with the ongoing presence of the beloved in the bereaved's continuing life. The presence may be entirely psychological in nature, the consequence of the neural circuits that O'Connor's research has documented. The presence may have features that exceed what the materialist framework can capture, the consequence of the deeper structures of consciousness that the various speculative frameworks have addressed. The presence may have specific theological significance within the tradition that the bereaved engages, the consequence of the broader frameworks that the great traditions have refined across centuries. The careful inquirer does not need to settle the question of which interpretation is correct in order to engage with the practices. The practices operate across the various interpretations, with the cultivation of the relationship being possible, regardless of which interpretation the inquirer eventually concludes is most accurate. This is what the inquiry has been pointing toward. Not a doctrine, not a system, not a framework that has to be believed. A recognition. A recognition that the question of whether the dead can hear the living is more open than the simple materialist framework would suggest, and more difficult than the simple religious framework would suggest. A recognition that the documented phenomena are real, even when their ultimate interpretation remains contested. A recognition that the great traditions have articulated convergent positions across widely separated cultures, even when the specific theological commitments differ, and even when the convergence does not amount to proof. A recognition that practices for cultivating the ongoing relationship with the deceased have been developed across various traditions, with the practices being beneficial for healthy adaptation to loss, regardless of what one concludes about the ultimate question of whether the dead can hear the living. The question of whether they can hear you is, ultimately, yours to answer. What the inquiry can offer is the resources for thinking about the question with care, with attention to what is actually known and what remains speculative, and with the cultivation of practices that have been developed by careful inquirers across thousands of years. The body that reads these words has, perhaps, lost someone who was loved. The loss may have been recent. The loss may have been many years ago. The experience of the loss continues, in some form, regardless of how much time has passed since the biological event of death. Do the dead hear you? No current science can answer this. No tradition can prove this. The materialist framework says they cannot, that the experiences you have of their presence are products of your own brain, that the bond you continue to feel is a feature of your own continuing neural circuits rather than any external reality. The speculative frameworks of contemporary physics complicate this picture in specific ways, suggesting that the question of what happens at biological death is more open than the materialist framework suggests. The great traditions affirm in their various vocabularies that biological death is not the complete cessation that ordinary thinking assumes. The convergences are striking. The convergences are not proof. The question remains open. The openness is itself a kind of answer. The openness means that you are not required to accept the simple materialist framework that treats the experience of continuing presence as merely a neural artifact. The openness also means that you are not required to accept any specific religious framework that treats the deceased as accessible through specific practices. The openness allows you to engage with the question as a genuine question, with the engagement being conducted with the kind of care that the question deserves. The openness is what careful inquiry across thousands of years has produced, and the openness is what the contemporary research and philosophical frameworks continue to maintain. What you do with this openness is the question whose answer is yours to develop. You may conclude that the materialist framework is sufficient, that the experiences you have of the deceased's continued presence are entirely products of your own grieving brain, and that the cultivation of continuing bonds is psychologically beneficial regardless of any external reality. This is a coherent position. You may conclude that the speculative frameworks have enough merit to warrant openness to the possibility that the deceased exist in some form that exceeds what the materialist framework allows. This is also a coherent position. You may conclude that the traditions have articulated genuine recognitions that contemporary research is in the process of confirming, with the implications being that the deceased are accessible through specific practices that the traditions have refined. This is also a coherent position. The choice among these positions is yours alone to make. What this inquiry has offered is the resources for making the choice with attention to what is actually established and what remains genuinely open. The bond that connected you to those you have lost is not a merely psychological phenomenon that ended with their biological death. Whether the bond is something more than psychological is a question that current research cannot definitively answer. Whether the deceased can hear you is a question that current research cannot definitively answer. What can be said with certainty is that the question is more open than the simple materialist framework suggests, that the great traditions have articulated convergent positions across thousands of years that warrant attention even when they do not amount to proof, and that the practices for cultivating the ongoing relationship with the deceased have been developed by careful inquirers across many traditions and have been documented to be beneficial for healthy adaptation to loss. The relationship continues, in some form, whatever the ultimate answer to the question of whether they can hear you turns out to be. What you make of this continuing relationship is yours alone to develop, across whatever remains of the embodied existence that you have for the time that you have it. They may not hear you in the way you imagine. They may hear you in a way that exceeds what imagination can capture. The question itself is more sophisticated than the simple yes or no that the question seems to demand. The answer that you arrive at, through the practices you cultivate and the discernment you bring to the moments when you sense them most strongly, is the answer that you will live with. What you make of this is yours alone to develop. The bond does not depend on the answer. Whatever you ultimately conclude about whether the dead can hear you, the bond that you had with them was real. The bond shaped who you became. The bond continues, in some form, to shape who you are becoming. The cultivation of awareness of this continuing shaping is one of the legitimate concerns of conscious existence, regardless of what one ultimately concludes about the deeper metaphysical questions. The practices that the traditions have refined and that contemporary research has documented to be beneficial are practices that can be cultivated regardless of which interpretation one finds most compelling. The practices operate at the level of the relationship, with the relationship being something that the bereaved can engage with regardless of what the relationship ultimately involves. What you do with the time you have, with the bonds you continue to carry from those who have died and with the bonds you continue to form with those who are still alive, is the question whose answer constitutes your conscious life. The dead may or may not hear you. The practices that the traditions have developed for engaging with them remain available, regardless. The cultivation of the ongoing relationship, in whatever form the careful inquirer concludes is most accurate, is one of the principal ways in which conscious existence can be inhabited with the seriousness that the conditions of conscious existence deserve.